Welcome, everyone. We're so grateful that you could join us tonight for this, our January fireside chat here at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And by here at the Library Company of Philadelphia, I mean on the Library Company of Philadelphia's Zoom. Um, my name is Allison Kronstadt, and I'm the events and programming coordinator for the Library Company. I really enjoy uh, overseeing all of our events and programs, our public events and programs, of which we offer many. And I encourage you to visit our calendar page on our website to learn more. I'll also be putting some information into the chat about some upcoming programs that we have. The Fireside Chat series is one of my particular favorites that we do at the Library Company because it's a really amazing opportunity to highlight scholars who have recently published work based on the research that they have done in the reading room at the Library Company. And it's wonderful to see how our collection items make their way into folks' work, which then makes its way into the world. So to speak a little bit more about the Library Company and to introduce tonight's featured presenter, it's my honor to introduce our librarian emeritus, James N. Green. So please take it away, Jim.
Hello, everyone. So before I introduce Rodrigo, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Library Company. I think we're probably a lot of people from California that are tuned in now and who might not know about us. So bear with me for a second. The Library Company of Philadelphia is an independent research library which preserves something like 1 million rare books, prints, photographs, newspapers, magazines, ephemera, manuscripts, documenting every aspect of American history and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. It's a research center serving a national and international constituency of scholars, and its exhibitions and programs like this one are open to the public free of charge. The Library Company is also America's oldest cultural institution. It was founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin as a subscription library, which is what you called a circulating library, a public library back in those days. It was supported by its shareholders, as it is to this day. From the Revolutionary War to 1800, when the national government was in Philadelphia, it served as the Library of Congress. Until the 1850s, it was the largest public library in America. The Library Company's collections grew with the nation and reflected the country's many faces and varied interests. All the books the Library Company acquired year by year over more than 2.5, well, actually now close on to 3 centuries, are still on our shelves, along with many others added since it was transformed into a research library in the 1950s. So that's who we are. This evening, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you Rodrigo Lazo, professor of Latin American and Latino literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who will be talking with us about his recent book, which has the wonderfully bilingual title of Letters from Philadelphia. I hope I'm saying that sort of right. Early Latino Literature and the Trans-American Elite. I first met Rodrigo in 2005 when he was a fellow at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and the Library Company. And he came to talk to me about the question at the center of his research, which was why and how were so many of the earliest works of Latino literature in the first 3 decades of the 19th century published in Philadelphia in Spanish. We discussed at length this fascinating archive and the many questions it raised. But after that, I heard nothing from him for 15 years. And so for me, it was a thrilling experience to read his book and realize that he had answered every single one of his questions and mine. It's a special pleasure to host him virtually here at the Library Company because it turns out this is one of the great hidden Philadelphia stories. Though in Rodrigo's hands, it's not only a story about Philadelphia, but above all, about what the idea of Philadelphia meant to Latino revolutionaries and exiles, and what opportunities it afforded them. Letters from Philadelphia was the winner of the 2021 Early American Literature Book Prize, and he has published several other books and articles on related aspects of trans-American Latino print culture. Rodrigo is himself a trans-American personage. He was born, did I say trans-American Latino print culture? Rodrigo is himself a trans-American personage. He was born in Guayaquil, Ecuador, lived in Puerto Rico for a couple of years, and then moved to Los Angeles at the age of 8. Before becoming a professor, he attended Columbia University School of Journalism and worked as a reporter for the Miami Herald. Then, for nearly 20 years, he was a professor at the University of California, Irvine, before assuming his new post at Santa Cruz last fall. Congratulations, Rodrigo. Please welcome Rodrigo Lazo.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for that very nice introduction. You were reminding me of various things in the past that I sometimes forget have happened. But yeah, I have moved around a bit, and I want to start just by thanking you, Jim, and Allison Cronstadt and the Library Company for having me for a fireside chat. This is a very special invitation because, as you'll see in a minute, my research really took hold there while visiting the Library Company, and I don't know if Jim knows how important he was to my project by helping me really understand the importance of the commercial aspects of print culture at the time and how a lot of these publications were woven into the work of printers and booksellers in Philadelphia in this period. So both Jim's scholarship and some of the references that he gave me were very, very important. So thank you for that. I also want to welcome and give a shout out to the students from my 19th century Spanish language literature course who are joining us and are reading some of the materials I'm talking about in Spanish this quarter here. So welcome to all of you, and I hope you maybe get inspired to go to the Library Company yourselves at some point and do some research. This evening, I'm speaking from the University of California, Santa Cruz, which is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. That is the official land acknowledgement of UC Santa Cruz, and as you just heard, it references Spanish colonialism as part of the history of the land on which I work. Spanish colonialism is also a part of the history behind the book Letters from Philadelphia. So let me now share a PowerPoint, and I'm going to take you through some of these aspects of this book. As I argue in this book, Philadelphia was an important publication center for Spanish language materials in the early 19th century, in part because writers who could not publish their work in the Spanish Americas made their way to the city in order to connect with printers. Some of these writers were forced into exile, and some remained in Philadelphia or the United States for decades. Hispanophone Philadelphia reminds us that the Spanish language has always been a part of the history of the United States, and not only in the territories that were formerly a part of the Spanish Empire, such as Florida or the US Southwest or California even, but also in the revolutionary period of the Americas in a city that is more usually associated with US independence. I would situate this book alongside Maria Lozano's An American Language, The History of Spanish in the United States, and other books that are recovering an important dimension of US history in the Spanish language with print culture, with a print culture emphasis, including Carmen Lamas's recent The Latino Continuum and the 19th Century Americas. So my book, what it does, unlike some others, is that it really takes Philadelphia as the central place of print culture at this particular moment in the early 19th century. It turns to Philadelphia with an F rather than the Anglophone spelling, because that is the way that many of the writers and intellectuals in my study thought of it, in terms of a city not only with material conditions, but also an imaginative space. So how did we get to Philadelphia, or how did I get to Philadelphia? One of the ways that scholarship begins often is we'll see something or read something that catches our attention. And in 1995, Arte Público Press published an edition of the novel Jicotencal. It is an 1826 novel that was published in Philadelphia in Spanish anonymously. It's a small book, 2 volumes, roughly 5 by 3 inches. And this book was at the time for sale in New York and 3 different locations in Philadelphia, including the Franklin Institute, which immediately tells us there was a book buying market in the area, which is something that I came to learn about more and more. This new edition of Jicotenca that was published in 1995 was part of the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project, an ongoing effort to locate, reprint, and study writings by Latinos in North America going back to the colonial period. In the introduction, Professors Luis Leal and Rodolfo Cortina wrote several pages contextualizing the site of publication and included numerous Spanish language titles and the names of writers and different government operatives that passed through Philadelphia and published works. That got me interested in trying to find out more, spending some more time with these books. And I came to learn that others had considered this, or at least framed it in terms of in relation to Philadelphia. For example, in the mid-20th century, the Venezuelan historian Pedro Graces called this group the Philadelphia Circle, or El Círculo de Filadelfia. So I was very interested in this in these materials. So in 2005, I applied for and received a fellowship from the Library Company and the Balk Institute, and I was able to spend some time at the Library Company reading some of the books in the collections. Now, mind you, this was before the internet, or rather before a lot of digitization emerged on the internet. So at this point, it was still necessary to go to look at the physical copy of many of these books. Since then, many of them have been digitized and are available now. But at that point, the Library Company provided invaluable support with its collections. Before I say a few more words about Philadelphia, I just want to note an important part of the kind of research that we do in relation to these areas, and how some of it is something that we need to continue to study and to build. The novel that sparked my interest in Philadelphia, Jicotenca, has also been part of a very, very lively debate going back decades about who wrote it, because it was not only an important part of U.S. literary history. It's also considered a very important part of Spanish language publishing in the Americas, because it's one of the earliest novels it published in the Spanish language anywhere in the Americas. And so scholars in Mexico and many other countries have historically wanted to know, well, who wrote this and why, right? So there have been many debates with many different people proposed as possible authors. And you see this edition here, Jicotenca, they have identified the author as Felix Varela, who was there at the time. But some year when my book came out, I had a section in it in which I argued that I did not think it was Varela, that it seemed like it was part of a different kind of publishing circuit, that it was more almost like part of a book-selling effort. And not long after that, the scholar Maria Barrera Agarwal, Ecuatoriana también, she located information that the author Cayetano Lanuza, that Cayetano Lanuza was the author, not Felix Varela. So that's the latest information. If you want to read more about this whodunit publication, the latest issue of Early American Literature has several articles on this topic, one by Maria Barrera Agarwal. So, but the important point that I want to take as we think about the rest of the material that I'm going to talk about is that Cayetano Lanuza was more of a printing impresario than an author. He was somebody who ran a kind of small publishing venture called Cayetano Lanuza, and they published books in Philadelphia and New York and sold them. So he was really part of more of a publishing circuit. He also published another novel that we know of, and he published a magazine in Cuba later. But so he was part of kind of publication and writing. But I definitely want to connect Cayetano Lanuza to publish the publishing industry, if you will, of the early 19th century. Okay, that's a little bit of a digression, but so let us return then to La Famosa Filadelfia. So in this early period of the 19th century, many of the writers and intellectuals who went there called it La Famosa Filadelfia. Now that can be translated as famous, but that word famosa functions more like celebrated or well-known. And among those who opposed the Spanish Empire, it emerged as this, celebrated place because it set an example for revolutionaries fighting against European colonialism. So it was almost like if Philadelphia was the site of the Declaration of Independence against England, the Spanish American intellectuals, some of them saw that as a potential place for the anti-colonial battle against Spain. So there was a kind of a discursive construction with Philadelphia with an F, right? As the wars of independence were breaking out in Spanish America, what we today would call Latin America, just imagine different types of political operatives and writers, intellectuals, professors, philosophers, making their way to what they viewed as a revolutionary city. Not only a national city of the United States, but really an anti-colonial inspiration for the Americas and the world. Philadelphia emerged as a space of liberation from colonial holdings. But it was also for them an actual city that they could visit and admire. So it was a print culture center. So let me say a little bit more about each of these three parts. It's a symbol that they take up. It's an actual city where they travel and they hold that as something to celebrate. But it's also an important place where print takes place. And I'm going to give you 3 slides now that will take us through those 3 aspects of the way they viewed Philadelphia. Okay, so the symbolic function is evident in the prologue to Vicente Rocafuerte's Ideas Necesarias para todo pueblo independiente que quiera ser libre. This book is actually a collection of translated documents from going back to the US Revolution. It includes a translation of Tom Paine's Common Sense, a translation of the US Declaration of Independence, a translation of translations of US constitutional documents. So in the prologue, he actually situates all of these translations as something that he can send out to the Americas as a way to provide almost a sample that can be then emulated. And here I quote, and this is my translation of what he writes, and I have the Spanish for you. And where would I find memories more sublime, lessons more heroic and more worthy of imitation, and situations more analogous to our actual political situation than in the celebrated Philadelphia? In this case, memory, the memorias, right? It's more of a reference to history as memory, meaning the US Revolutionary War. And in positing an analogy, Rocafuerte was recommending that the newly independent countries in the Southern Americas modeled themselves on the United States. As such, this book, which circulated in Mexico, there was an edition published in Mexico 2 years later in 23, contained these documents almost like really carrying political theory and political thought from one part of the Americas to another. So keep in mind here that translation was an important part of the work that many intellectuals did in Philadelphia. So when writers translated something like Common Sense or the US Declaration of Independence, they were trying to carry those ideas across the continent. And I would say that in this case, the symbol of Philadelphia is very much connected to constitutional principles. As the decade went on, the decade of the 1820s, many countries in Latin America were debating how to establish new constitutions. And some of the other materials that come out of Philadelphia are very much connected to these. How do we organize the new nations that have emerged in Latin America? But they were also interested in the city itself. Philadelphia was very much a material place, okay, a living lab of republicanism where people could walk around and actually see what a place like this looked like. In 1824, the poet José María Heredia sent a letter to his uncle in Cuba recounting a walking tour of the city. Here, Heredia describes various places, various buildings as he walks around, talks about the layout of the streets. And in an interesting turn, he compares the first U.S. bank to the Parthenon. Okay, so one of the things that he says is that it's really the most beautiful building that he has ever seen. He's like enjoying just, the air as he stands on the steps leading up to this building. And he says that he doubts, and I'm translating here, that the Parthenon, even in its moment of greater luster, could rival the bank in simple elegance and beauty. So one of the things that we see there is just very much a kind of anti-colonial framing, right? This idea that Philadelphia as city can stand up to Europe as an amazing city that is part of a kind of American revolutionary tradition that crosses from one part of the Americas to another, as opposed to Europe and its much older cities that were venerated by certain people because of a kind of urban mystique, right? So here we have an example of an urban center in the Americas that also has many great things to complement it. So again, this becomes a very material reality for the writers that can then be taken and transferred over to Latin America as its countries are fighting for independence. The third aspect that I want to emphasize is Philadelphia's print culture center. Okay, it had at that point, Philadelphia was still one of the really the most important printing center in the United States. New York becomes much more important later, a little bit later, but at the time there were just dozens of printers in Philadelphia, and this was the kind of place where writers who had some resources could make arrangements with printers to print a book. In some cases, these were projects in which the writer would pay for a run of the books and then try to transport it to a country in the Southern Americas. In other cases, there were books that were published to be sold in both locally in Philadelphia and New York, but also on an international stage. And someone like Cayetano Lanuza that I was mentioning for a while was very much involved in that kind of selling of books. Here I'm giving you two examples of books that were published in Philadelphia, where the print situation there allowed these writers to really release this work. So the one on the right is El Triunfo de la Libertad sobre el Despotismo. And just to give you the kind of variety of these books and titles there, this is a very interesting book by someone who was forced into exile. What he actually does in this particular book is to make an argument against monarchical rule using theology, particularly the Old Testament. So this is someone who has studied the Old Testament at length and really deploys that and cites many passages from the Old Testament in order to say, no, the Bible does not support monarchical government, and the king is actually a despot. So it's a very biblical argument that he develops there. The second one, the 1823 Cartas Americanas, the full title is actually Cartas Americanas Políticas y Morales, etc., by Manuel Lorenzo Vidaurre, who's from Peru, also has to go into exile. This book is a very interesting collection of different essays short pieces that have everything from debates about constitutional principles, a piece against slavery, and then there are these letters that are inserted in there that are actually love letters to his sister-in-law. It turns out that this gentleman, Vidaurre, had an affair with his sister-in-law and decided that in Philadelphia he could publish these letters and go public with this love that he had for his sister. And they're all mixed in there. So at one point you're reading about constitutions, and in the next one it's a love letter. So he thought himself as the Peruvian Rousseau, or was known that way. People called him that. So again, you see the kind of the variety of the different types of books that that were printed there. And the other reason why Philadelphia was important was because of censorship in many parts of the Spanish Americas. So in Spanish America at this period, right before the Wars of Independence, printing was restricted in several ways. So number one, there were actually a limited number of presses. There were some places that, some cities that today we would consider major cities that did not get presses until really late in the 18th century or early in the 19th century. Other places like Mexico City had a history of printing, but not all the cities in Spanish America. So there was a limited number of presses, and writers needed to go elsewhere to publish this book. London was also an area, a city where writers published their materials. Number two, in order to print a book in Spanish America under colonial rule, people needed to get licenses to be a printer, but also licenses to publish a particular book. So there was a certain amount of control exerted by colonial authorities. Number three, there was a certain amount of censorship from the Inquisition, in which people connected to the church would read material and then either ban it or take it away from people. So just something that I have up here on this slide involves one of the really the more notorious cases of this kind of censorship. It's related to a book called El Desengaño del Hombre, or Man Undeceived, by Santiago Felipe de Puglia, an Italian immigrant who in 1794 published one of the earliest Spanish language books out of Philadelphia. And this book is, as you can imagine, challenges the entire Spanish monarchy, because it's really an argument against divine right, the divine right of monarchies. And so the Inquisition banned this book, and then what you have here is a picture of the broadside that was, possibly put up in some part of Mexico, and the library company acquired a copy of this broadside, banning the book. So the broadside is itself a very energetic piece of writing, accusing Puglia of being haughty, disobedient, blasphemous, treacherous, and then they even call him a monster. And according to the edict that they handed down in this broadside here, anybody with a copy of this book, El Desengaño del Hombre, would be excommunicated and also fined, right? So you can see how there was a certain amount of just the restrictions in some of the parts of Spanish America were such that there was a real sense of Philadelphia as offering an alternative that they could not get at home. Manuel Lorenzo de Vidaurre, whom I was talking about a minute ago, in his book actually has a scene in Cartas Americanas in which the censors from the Inquisition come to his house, and he calls, they're looking around for books that he might have. And he says they were like rabid dogs, is what he calls them. So again, there was a certain amount of certain limitations that prevented writers from just, getting out their work. I want to say something about these trans-American movements. Something I try to connect here is how political movements, in this case against colonialism, Spanish colonialism, were connected to the physical movements of the writers and intellectuals, by which I mean migration, right? So there's movement in terms of the political operations or political organization, at the same time that we have migration as a kind of as another kind of movement. And then the third kind of movement that I think connects here is the circulation of books, because something that they were trying to do was to move books, all of it going beyond like the organization of the nation, right? In terms of if we're going to cross, then things were crossing constantly from one place to another. Something for us to reflect on is that today, even in academic fields, there continues to be a hold of a kind of thinking that divides the United States from Latin America. And even in our organization of academic fields, there's American studies and there's Latin American studies. But this material is a reminder that at different points in history, these divisions were not as solid or not as influential as they are now. Many intellectuals here saw themselves as really part of the Americas or part of an American anti-colonial process rather than just being part of one nation. So that as we think then geographically about people moving from one place to another, we might consider how we analyze books that were moving from one place to another. So if we return to a very influential model that I find helpful in thinking through some of these questions is Robert Darnton's communication circuit, in which he talks about a kind of process, but which starts with the writing and includes the printing and the book selling, and then the readership. And where are all of those? What happens if we think of a communication circuit in an international form, or in this case, a trans-American approach in which a book might be written in one place, published in another, and then sent to somewhere else. So for example, some of the letters in Cartas Americanas were written in Lima, and then Vidaurre goes to Philadelphia and publishes the book there, and then the book may be circulated in other parts of the Americas. Or Rocafuerte wrote some of his letters in his book on constitutional principles, and then published it elsewhere and circulated it in Latin America. So you see how often writing, printing, and circulation may be crossing from one country to another. Sometimes all three are in different places. Sometimes somebody may write something and print it and then send it something else. So this movement is what inspired me to think a little bit about letters or cartas as a way to think about this material. So my title, Letters from Philadelphia, is a play on the Spanish cartas, which appeared in the titles of so many of the books, and I've put some of them here. So the Spanish Carta is influenced by an Enlightenment association with an epistolary claim as a way to address a broad reading public, right? So there are many books in the French and Anglophone traditions that also use the terminology of the letter or the carta, right? And one of the ones that's closest to us, work in American literature, broadly conceived here, is Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer. So what you have here is the letter as a kind of book that is addressing someone, but is also in some ways taking up a variety of topics. That's why in the book that I was talking to you about a minute ago, where it said, well, there's a love letter next to a constitutional letter about constitutions, there's that kind of mix because the book of letters or the book of cartas is usually taking up many different kinds of topics, right? So it's not just one particular aspect that we see. So in terms of the ones that I have here, and again, these are very, very different in terms of what they contain. The different kinds of some of them are much more political, and some of them are linked to someone trying to make a very, very definite appeal to readers in another place. Cartas al Pidio by Felix Varela, which is on the list here, is actually sent to Cuba, where it doesn't get a whole lot of attention. So Varela writes this letter very much to go to Cuba and to the youth there. He thinks of it as a book for young people in Cuba, but it doesn't get a whole lot of attention. And yet you can see that for Varela, who had also published another periodical called El Habanero out of Philadelphia, he really thinks of his work then as circulating far outside where he is ultimately settled, which is Philadelphia and then New York. This issue of letters also, I think, moves me a bit closer to the questions of intimacy. Okay, so the whole notion of sharing letters was also connected to notions of brotherhood and friendship, in very much in this Enlightenment sense, fraternité. And so there's this very much of a kind of intellectual discourse among men. It's a very male-centered kind of exchange, but it gets past the like outright political functions of this into this elements of intimacy, right? And so it becomes very kind of like a kind of close address. And yet I find that then Cartas navigates that sense and it closes the gap between what we might think of as a distance between writing from somebody writing from one country to another. But if it can sound intimate enough, if it can feel like it's addressed to a specific person, that helps us close the gap, right? So the letter implies a distance, but it's because the letter is usually written to a specific person, it can also help to close that gap. Many of the letters here, even when they're published in books to a general readership, are have a kind of address that that implies this kind of closeness. One of them is Don querido mío de todo mi corazón, which we can translate roughly to dearest beloved who holds all of my heart, right? So you can see that there's this closeness, or they'll sign off with QSMB, which is initials for que su mano besa, who kisses your hand. So there's this kind of sense that it's very much a kind of decorum of a part of an exchange of ideas. So as you might imagine, how somebody made his way, and it was mostly men, right? So how they made their way over to Philadelphia involved the need to have some resources. And so many of the participants in this culture were either wealthy or were connected to families that could pay for them to be there. And in some cases could pay for their own run of books. Vicente Rocafuerte was an extremely wealthy man who was highly educated and eventually became president of Ecuador after his time in Philadelphia. But he would travel all over Europe. He was there's a letter from him to a U.S. congressman at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Very much plugged in. So if you can imagine he was going to Philadelphia. He had connections there. He knew people. He was a very well-placed person. So in a different way, José María Heredia, who wrote our Philadelphia letter, his family was mostly in Cuba at that particular moment, and he was being funded by an uncle who actually had a coffee plantation where there were slaves. So Heredia was opposed to slavery, as were most of the participants in this in La Famosa Filadelfia. But his family was still connected to that, and clearly he was benefiting from the slave economy in Cuba. So I point this out because I ultimately find that it's so important for us to consider the social position of these writers and intellectuals when we are analyzing their work. In part because it raises some really, really important questions about what was left out of the Philadelphia writing and what did this connection that they had to La Famosa Filadelfia, what was it based on and what was not included as part of that. So one of the things that I argue in my book is that in trying to build a kind of celebration of Philadelphia and celebration of the United States as the ultimate, example of anti-colonial success, many of the writers overlooked conditions for enslaved people and indigenous populations in the U.S. They mostly steered clear of those kinds of topics. Again, they would state their opposition to slavery, but they would not, for example, talk about the conditions for enslaved people or even free blacks in the United States. And at times they would only paper over the relationships with indigenous people. In addition, the Philadelphia discourse allowed for a kind of abstract notion of constitutional government that cut out the local conditions in many other countries. So, for example, when writers came from countries with large indigenous populations, some of them who didn't speak Spanish, that matter was not considered, right? It was all very much like we're gonna have a constitution that that mirrors the abstract principles as articulated in something like the U.S. Constitution. In addition, I also just have already noted that cartas, the letters, this discourse was very, very male-centered, right? And so at times you can really see that there was very little in the way of a kind of self-reflection on those particular issues. And the result is that I do think that the amazing contradiction, or one of the amazing contradictions of the writings that come out of La Famosa Filadelfia, is that they recapture the spirit of Philadelphia as an anti-colonial and revolutionary site that was of great importance. At the same time, is that they teach us how emphasizing just a kind of abstract notion of a citizen allows for political theory to overlook what the specific conditions might be in a particular location. So I'm going to stop there. I would love to hear some questions from you, and also some comments, especially if you have anything to say about Philadelphia. If you have knowledge about Philadelphia, I always love to hear what others have found. I know there are different aspects of the city, I think, that might even be related to some of the material that I've been talking about here. So please share your questions and comments, and I'm going to shut down the PowerPoint at this point.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lazo. That really, I'm amazed by how many different areas one thread can touch on. And I think you did such a good job drawing all of those out. One thing I was really struck by that I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about before we get into some questions from the audience is sort of your use of framing language. So there are, a lot of the term Latino itself is much younger than a lot of the time period that is covered in your book. I'm wondering what made you decide to use that word, and how you think sort of tracing Latinidad older than the term itself can help us understand both the time period of your area of study and this time period today.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an important part of my work, in part because something that I'm trying to do with the figures in this book, with many of them, is pull them out of a nationalist historiography. So let's take, for example, José María Heredia. My students were reading Heredia this week and last week, and Heredia is often discussed as a Cuban poet. He was claimed as the great nationalist Cuban poet in the 1930s. And very much framed as the poet of Cuba, who articulates a kind of Cuban sensibility. Well, Heredia actually, he did have great love for Cuba. He actually spent very little time there when you considered his years. He died at a young age of 36, and during that time, he lived in. He grew up for a part of his youth in the Dominican Republic. He spent more than 2 years in the United States. He lived out the last part of his life in Mexico. He is really more of a trans-American figure than solely a Cuban figure, or as I like to claim, somebody who's part of the U.S. I consider him a poet of the U.S. He publishes his first edition of his collection of poetry in New York in 1825, and travels all around the U.S. and writes, poems about Niagara and Washington and all kinds of different U.S. locations. So the interesting part of that is, how do we consider Heredia as part of U.S. literature, and not only as part of Cuba, right? And so I think that the term Latino, or what today people might want to use as Latinx, or Hispanic, some people still prefer that term. What that does is it really allows us to see the connections between the different sites that these writers move in. So I think if I could just go back, since Jim brought up a little bit of my own background, I'm originally from Ecuador. I still consider myself Ecuadorian, but I'm also a US Latino. I grew up here. And so I think a lot of us inhabit multiple identities as we cross these territories. And that's, I think, something that you see very much in these writers. And I want to carry that conversation in relation to Latinidad as a predominantly US frame.
Thank you so much for that. So another question from an attendee, to what extent, if any, did individuals from Spanish-speaking populations and countries experience discrimination in Philadelphia?
So that's a great question. And there's some moments in the book where I know like specific places where people might have said disparaging comments. So talk about like the kinds of different experiences that people might have. And I think this happens to a lot of these elite writers in the 19th century, where in their home countries, they may have been viewed as white and granted a kind of racial privilege based on that, and definitely privileged because of their economic situation. But once they get to the US, they're viewed as some kind of othered, either Spaniard or Cuban Spaniard, or named in some other way. And sometimes some of that can be disparaging, in part of because of the historical tension between England and Spain, and this whole notion of the Black legend, right? So there are moments when people will make disparaging remarks about them, so that's one of the great contradictions of how coming to the U.S. Places people in situations that where they lose some of the ease which they might have moved in their own countries, or the language itself, also the English language, right? So Heredia was fluent in Latin and Greek, and but he had a really hard time with the English language, and he was constantly complaining that it just, he couldn't quite get into it. So, that made it difficult for him as he was traveling and all that.
Absolutely. And then just to follow up on that, I'm curious how religious difference might have come into the picture, both in terms of interactions within Philadelphia, and also, if at all, how that sort of contextualize these folks' understanding of their revolutionary struggles, both as similar and different to the revolution in the United States.
So the example that I would give there that's very concrete comes a little bit about after his time in Philadelphia. So Felix Varela is actually a priest. He's a philosopher priest. He published his books on philosophy in Cuba before he comes to Philadelphia. And then ultimately he leaves Philadelphia and he goes to New York and has a parish there, and works in a parish in New York, Manhattan, for many years. And once there, he's getting a kind of double discrimination, both as a Catholic from Protestants, and also as as somebody of Cuban Spanish background. So and there were moments in which religious conflicts arose. The one thing that I would add is I don't do a whole lot of this in my book, but there's a very, very lively publication of Spanish language Bibles in the early 19th century. That's an area for some important research to be done for somebody who really wants to run with that. It's like, who's publishing the Bibles? Where are they sending them? Whom are they for? So that's another very important area. But there are, interestingly enough, though, I will add one more thing. Manuel Torres, who was very well placed in Philadelphia and published some books there. He was part of one of the Catholic churches in Philadelphia. I want to say it's St. Mary's, if I'm remembering correctly. And there's actually a plaque there for him. And for a long time, he was kind of viewed as part of the history of that parish.
That's so cool. And that sort of continues to pull out the ways that you can see the imprints that these individuals left on the physical landscape of Philadelphia, which can be seen even today. So That's a really interesting little tidbit. We have a quick demographic question, which is how large was the Spanish-speaking population in Philadelphia in the early 19th century?
That's an excellent question that I've spent some time just fretting about, and I haven't been able to quite put a number on it. It might have been, it wasn't a huge population, but at any one time it might have been anywhere from up to 100 to a couple hundred. It wasn't a huge population, but at the time, the population of Philadelphia in the 1810s, 1820s wasn't that large either, right? So I'd have to go back and look at all the numbers, but I think we were talking about a city of about 50 or 70,000 people. So it wasn't huge, but it was definitely sizable enough that there were interactions and there were houses where people gathered. It was really part of an early immigration to Philadelphia that becomes much more pronounced later in the century, when Puerto Ricans start coming to Philadelphia, and by the 20th century, there's some really large communities. So this were some of the earliest examples of that. And one other thing that I would say is that in relation to that, some of these publications were driven by a book buying public that wanted to learn the Spanish language. There's always been a certain amount of interest in books from Spanish speakers or people who are learning Spanish. And so someone like Heredia brings that up even in the introduction to his collection of poetry, saying this is also published for those who are learning Spanish.
Thank you so much. We have a sort of two-part question, comment that actually, Jim, I think you might be able to weigh in on a little bit, although Rodrigo, I'm sure you have some information as well. So we have, thank you so much for this enlightening talk. I'm wondering how these books and broadsides came to the Library Company of Philadelphia.
So yeah, Jim would be the person to answer that. And I would follow up with that. It's like, Jim, can you remind me that broadside that we have there from the Inquisition? Was that something that you acquired while you were there?
Yes, it was.
Because I remember we had this great moment where he says, "Oh, look, I have this amazing broadside here."
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of them have been bought in modern times, partly because of there has been an interest in this kind of material, not only on our staff, but also there's a local bookseller, a bookselling firm, I think now retired, but David Shevchuk of Philadelphia Rare Books and Manuscripts Company is probably the country's leading authority on the bibliography of Spanish language printing in America. And we bought a few of these things in modern times from him. I think we may have bought the Inquisition broadside from him too, but I can't remember for sure. But also, there's another aspect of this, and that is that one of the main publishers of these books in the 18 teens and 20s was Matthew Carey and his son Henry Charles Carey, the firm of Matthew Carey and Sons, Carey and Lee, probably at that moment the largest literary publishers in America. And he was one of these people who had this, who set his eye on this South American market for reasons that are a little bit mysterious. I think maybe you found something about that you could say to me, because I don't think he ever made a lot of money from selling these books, but I think he also had some kind of a almost globalist ambition to take American books, his books, in fact, all over the world. He sent agents to Calcutta, to Canton, with his books, and he also sent agents to Havana and to Mexico and Valparaiso and Buenos Aires. So he was so interested in this kind of trade that he had a lot of these books in his own library, which came to us when he died in 1839. So whether any of these books were actually, say, available for loan in the library company, when they came out, is a question I can't answer. It's I think more of an interest that comes from not from the generality of our readers, but from certain people who were using the library company and as their sort of collected library.
Yeah, definitely with the Matthew Carey, I very much took it his excursions into Latin America, and I believe that was even the term that was used. It was something like excursion in his account books.
He called them adventures.
Ventures, that's what it was.
Adventures.
Adventures,
A for
adventures.
yeah.
Uh, the, those were part of a much broader, right? Because as you say, there was Calcutta, there was some different locations. I was really interested, and if any of you want to know more about this, you can. There are parts in the book that get into is that sometimes the trade was so commercial that he was not only just sending printed books, but also just notebooks and stationery. But then they would pay back sometimes in goods, not necessarily just a monetary payback. And there's one where he trades books for cigars. Right. And so there's this kind of it's like, yes, you can send me cigars, but make sure they are Havana, the Havana cigars of the best quality. So there was really this commercial trade that went on that was very much the books were part of a really part of a global network that he was trying to build.
Actually, if I remember, sorry, I'm getting a text here. Those cigars that he got that were supposed to be the best Habanero cigars, I think they were called. He was cheated. He later found out, and that they were actually not very good cigars at all. And he took a complete loss on the entire shipment of cigars, which is quite large. And so when you start looking into the question of whether any of these ventures were actually profitable, one or two of them were, many of the others weren't. And I think you have to chalk this up to this kind of, as I say, almost globalist, certainly not at all confined to American markets for book publishing for Americans. And a lot of other American publishers felt the same way.
So what really interests me there is that's something that I learned from you, Jim, is that the importance of this commercial aspect of this publication scene in early 19th century Philadelphia, because that's what allowed for the writers from Spanish America to really plug into that, right? In terms of it wasn't, when I first started looking at those books, I thought, oh, of course you think of it's the political motivations, but often it was a conjunction of those two, where somebody might have an anti-colonial position, but really once they get into the print culture market there, they were dealing with, just the buying and selling of paper or something like how much does paper cost, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I know we're at 8. Do you have time to answer one more question?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So this was part 2 of the question that was a sort of tangential question from the same person. Also, if I understand correctly, you read QSMB as an endearing signature. I wonder if this might also be read as a kind of gesture to / signifying of the monarchical culture. I'm thinking about the argument that Greg Downes makes in Declarations of Dependence about post-Civil War politics and reproductions of monarchical culture during that time.
Yeah, no, that's a really good good question. I read it more as a kind of it's slightly ironic, right? In terms of I kiss your hand kind of thing. So and so if it is invoking that, then it's doing so in an ironic way, in the same way that it's almost like a play on the intimacy of the two people sharing the letters. So that's that's a really good point. And the other thing is, a lot of these salutations and the way these letters are framed sometimes are people playing, right, with language and playing with a sense of what can I say here and what can I not say?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lazo, and thank you all very much for coming tonight. We hope you'll tune in for a future fireside chat. I've put some options of ways that you can stay connected to the Library Company of Philadelphia in the Zoom chat as well, so feel free to click on some of those links. Thank you as well, Jim, for chiming in and for introducing Dr. Lazo. I hope everyone has a wonderful night. Stay warm if you're over here on the East Coast with us. If you're in San
Thank you. Thank you very
Francisco.
much to everybody.